Welcome to If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship, a podcast exploring the relational foundations of psychotherapy through the lenses of attachment theory, trauma-informed care, person-centered psychology, and contemporary psychotherapy research. This podcast is hosted from the perspective of someone who has sat in both chairs, as a counseling graduate student studying the theories, and as someone who has been a client in therapy. My hope is to bridge the gap between clinical language and lived reality, to explore not only what therapy is supposed to do, but how healing actually happens between two human beings in a room. I hope to uncover the primary mechanism of change in psychotherapy, and spoiler alert, it is not a specifically branded modality or technique. If Your Therapist Knew explores the often unspoken aspects of the client experience that shape whether therapy feels safe, connecting, and truly healing. In graduate counseling programs, we constantly hear the phrase, the relationship is everything. It shows up in lectures, textbooks, supervision meetings, and research articles. But what does it really mean? We are going to explore the empirical foundations of why the therapeutic relationship is so critical. What does it actually mean that the relationship is the work? Is the relationship simply a warm backdrop for the real interventions? Is it just rapport building before the therapist starts applying techniques? Or is the relationship itself functioning as a mechanism of change? Because if it is the mechanism of change, that fundamentally alters how we understand psychotherapy. We often think we go to therapy for the advice or the tools, but decades of data tell a different story. The relationship isn't a polite backdrop where the treatment happens. Rooted in biologically detected safety, the relationship itself is the mechanism of change. It is the treatment. Today, I want to synthesize a wide body of psychotherapy research to explore one central idea. The therapeutic relationship is far more than a supportive backdrop. It's one of the most powerful evidence-based components of effective therapy, with measurable efficacy comparable to many medical interventions. That's a massive claim. But researchers have spent decades examining this exact question, and again, the data points back towards something profoundly human. Human connection can rewire our nervous systems. People heal through emotionally corrective relationships. Not through worksheets alone, not through insight alone, not through diagnostic labels alone, but through safe, attuned, collaborative connection. So in this episode, we're going to move beyond vague therapeutic cliches and explore the actual architecture of healing, the working alliance, attachment theory, empathy and feeling felt, rupture and repair, nervous system co-regulation, therapeutic presence, and why the therapist's own humanity matters far more than many people realize. When we understand the mechanics, we stop reducing therapy to technique and begin understanding why genuine human connection can reorganize an entire internal world. I think one of the most effective entry points into this conversation is dismantling a very persistent cultural image of therapy. When many people picture psychotherapy, they imagine the classic Freudian stereotype, a distant therapist sitting silently in a chair, occasionally scribbling notes while the client talks endlessly. The therapist is imagined as a neutral observer, objective, detached, interpreting. And that image subtly communicates something important, that the therapist's value lies primarily in technical expertise. The implication is that the therapist administers treatment to the client, and the therapist's personality or presence is largely irrelevant as long as the intervention is correct. But decades of psychotherapy outcome research fundamentally challenge that assumption. Bruce Wampold's contextual model and John Norcross's extensive meta-analyses repeatedly demonstrate that what researchers call common factors, things like empathy, alliance, collaboration, responsiveness, and emotional attunement, are among the strongest predictors of therapeutic outcome across nearly every treatment modality. And this is where things become interesting, because the therapeutic relationship is not merely adjacent to treatment. The relationship itself is a primary part of the treatment. That does not mean techniques are useless. cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, internal family systems. These approaches absolutely matter. But techniques function within a relational vehicle. Without a secure relational foundation, even brilliant interventions often fail to penetrate deeply enough to create lasting change. Why? Because therapy requires clients to take enormous psychological risks. It asks people to dismantle coping mechanisms that once kept them alive, confront memories avoided for decades, expose shame, revisit grief, challenge their identity, and become emotionally vulnerable in ways that may have never previously felt safe. A person will not willingly enter those psychological territories unless the relational vehicle feels secure enough to hold them. And that brings us directly into the structure researchers call the working alliance. In 1979, psychologist Edward Borden proposed one of the most influential models in psychotherapy research, the working alliance theory. Borden argued that a successful therapeutic alliance rests upon three interconnected pillars: bond, goals, and tasks. And what is fascinating is that this framework transformed the therapeutic relationship from something vague and abstract into something observable and measurable. Let's look at each component. The bond is the emotional foundation of the relationship. Mutual trust, respect, emotional safety, and genuine human regard. It is the sense that the therapist is emotionally present with you rather than simply analyzing you. This was later referred to as the real relationship, the authentic human connection existing underneath professional roles. And for many clients, this experience is profoundly unfamiliar. To be listened to carefully, to be emotionally held without judgment, to be taken seriously without being controlled, to reveal something painful without being shamed. The bond is not superficial warmth, it is psychological safety. The second pillar involves shared agreement on what therapy is actually trying to accomplish. This sounds simple, but it matters enormously. If a client believes therapy is about healing trauma, while the therapist believes therapy is about symptom management, the alliance weakens immediately. Research consistently shows that collaborative goal setting strengthens engagement, trust, and treatment outcomes. The client is not being dragged through therapy, they are participating in it. The third pillar involves agreement on how the work will happen. These are some methods: journaling, EMDR, mindfulness, cognitive restructuring, parts work, psychodynamic exploration. If the therapist and client are not aligned on the tasks, therapy can begin to feel like what one clinician described as a cart without a horse. Evidence-based therapy equals the relationship plus the technique. So how do they interact? The technique provides a coherent structure and a rationale that both the therapist and the client can believe in. And engaging in that structured task actually strengthens the alliance. But the relationship is the vehicle that makes the technique possible. So without a secure vehicle, the technique goes absolutely nowhere. Any effective therapy requires the client to take massive psychological risks, like facing terrifying memories, dismantling entrenched coping mechanisms. A client simply will not do this unless the vehicle feels entirely secure. The technique will go nowhere when the relational vehicle is not secure. And this distinction matters because many people assume the alliance simply means liking your therapist. But a strong alliance is far more collaborative and dynamic. You can genuinely like a therapist and still not feel safe enough to do transformative work. And this is where attachment theory becomes essential. How does this relationship actually reorganize a person's psychology? How does sitting in a room with a warm person fix a deep-seated trauma? That's where we have to look at the data coming out of attachment theory. It suggests we have to tap into our earliest evolutionary blueprints to really understand this. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. They originally developed attachment theory to understand infant caregiver dynamics. They discovered that human beings have a profound hardwired biological imperative to seek proximity to a caregiver for survival. What modern psychotherapy research discovered is that these same attachment systems become activated in therapy. In many ways, the therapist functions as an attachment figure, not as a parent, not as a friend, but as a safe relational presence capable of reorganizing internal working models. So the therapist essentially becomes a new attachment figure for the client. And the literature makes a very clear distinction between two vital functions the therapist provides in this role: the secure base and the safe haven. The secure base is the launching pad. It is the predictable, grounded relational environment that allows a client to explore painful material without becoming psychologically lost. When the therapist establishes a secure base, the client feels grounded enough to take emotional risks. Consistency matters, reliability matters. The client begins to internalize, I can explore difficult emotions because someone stable is with me. This is why clients often carry the therapist's voice internally between sessions. Over time, the therapist becomes integrated into the client's internal world as a regulating presence. The safe haven is the landing pad. It's the feeling of, I can come back when I'm overwhelmed. Think about moments of profound panic, grief, shame, or emotional flooding. In those moments, logic alone rarely pulls you out of it. Human beings regulate through relationship first. A grounded therapist can help a client move through emotional overwhelm by offering attunement, calmness, containment, and emotional steadiness. What the therapist provides is a corrective relational experience within a safe framework. Clients learn something transformative. I can be distressed without being abandoned. I can be vulnerable without being exploited. I can be emotionally real and still remain connected. That is not merely supportive. That is reorganizing attachment expectations at a deeply embodied level. This brings us to Carl Rogers, whose influence on psychotherapy cannot be overstated. Rogers' most radical move was dethroning the therapist as the expert who repairs a broken psyche. In this model, the client is the expert on themselves. The therapist is more like a fellow traveler or a philosophical companion whose job isn't to fix you, but to remove the relational barriers so your natural internal capacity for growth can finally take over. Rogers radically shifted psychotherapy away from technical authority and toward authentic human presence. His theory rested on three core therapeutic conditions: congruence, unconditional positive regard, and accurate empathic understanding. And remarkably, decades of outcome research continue to support the importance of these conditions in order for deep psychological change to occur. Congruence means genuineness. The therapist is not hiding behind a rigid professional mask. Their external presence aligns with their internal experience. This does not mean therapists disclose everything they think or feel. Clinical boundaries remain essential, but effective therapists are psychologically present and emotionally real. Clients are extraordinarily sensitive to emotional incongruence. They often know when a therapist is mechanically applying empathy rather than genuinely connecting. Unconditional positive regard is often misunderstood as simply being nice, but it's much deeper than that. Unconditional positive regard means holding deep respect for the client's humanity, even when they reveal shame, self-destruction, or chaos. It means refusing to reduce a person to their symptoms or their defenses. And for clients carrying profound shame, this can become an emotionally disorienting experience because many people expect rejection the moment they become fully visible. Rogers described empathy as entering the client's internal frame of reference, as if climbing into their world and looking outward through their eyes. Later, Daniel Siegel described a related concept called feeling felt, and this distinction matters enormously. Feeling understood intellectually is different from feeling emotionally experienced by another person. Clients often know the difference immediately. One feels clinical, the other feels deeply regulating. When a person truly feels felt, isolation begins to soften, and from this relational stance emerges what psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called the holding environment, a psychological space where the client feels emotionally held, where difficult affect can be metabolized collaboratively until the client can eventually regulate it independently. When we talk about the holding environment, we aren't just talking about a supportive hug. We are talking about the therapist's capacity to take in your raw, unprocessed panic or shame, what the literature calls beta elements, and emotionally digest them for you, returning them to you in a form that finally feels tolerable and thinkable. One of the most important shifts in modern psychotherapy is the recognition that the therapist themselves functions as the primary instrument of change, the real relationship. So the therapist isn't just playing a role. The therapist functions as the instrument of change through their authentic presence. It's a genuine human encounter. Modern clinical research actually categorizes these elements as evidence-supported relationship factors. So these are things like empathy, collaboration, responsiveness, and positive regard. So they aren't just nice to have, they are empirically proven to drive therapeutic outcomes. So the clinical framework, whether it's CBT or other technique, that's just the sheet music. But the therapist's genuine regulated human presence is the physical instrument actually producing the sound. What's fascinating here is that the data explicitly supports this analogy. You can have the most brilliant sheet music in the world, but if the instrument is cracked or out of tune, the music is not going to sound great. And this has enormous implications for therapy, because it means therapy is not simply learning interventions, it's about cultivating presence. A therapist can possess extraordinary intellectual knowledge and still struggle relationally if they remain emotionally defended, rigid, dysregulated, or disconnected from themselves. Research increasingly shows that therapists who function only as technicians often fail to produce deep relational change. Clients do not merely respond to what therapists do, they respond to how therapists are. This includes emotional responsiveness, warmth, attunement, pacing, vocal tone, groundedness, flexibility, humility, and the therapist's availability to remain emotionally available under stress. And this becomes especially important when we consider nervous system regulation. One of the most fascinating and clinically important ideas emerging from modern attachment research and interpersonal neurobiology is the concept of neuroception. Neuroception is a term developed by Dr. Stephen Porges within polyvagal theory, referring to the nervous system's subconscious ability to detect safety or threat in our environment and in other people. And what's important is that this happens constantly, automatically, and incredibly fast. Long before the cognitive brain fully analyzes what's being said, and long before a client consciously decides whether they like or trust a therapist, the body is already scanning the room. The nervous system is asking, does this person feel safe? Can I relax here? Am I emotionally protected enough to be vulnerable? And remarkably, much of this process occurs outside of conscious awareness. Through the vagus nerve, the massive communication pathway connecting the brain with the heart, lungs, gut, and autonomic nervous system, we are continuously detecting subtle physiological and relational cues. Not just obvious behaviors, but microscopic ones. Facial expression, eye contact, tone of voice, breathing rhythm, pacing, emotional steadiness, tension in the body, responsiveness, presence. Human nervous systems are extraordinarily sensitive to other nervous systems. And this has profound implications for therapy because therapy is not only an intellectual process, it's also biological and relational. Modern attachment and trauma research increasingly suggests something incredibly important. Human nervous systems regulate in relationship before they regulate independently. In other words, emotional regulation is relational before it becomes individual. We learn to regulate ourselves by first being co-regulated by another person. And this is part of why the therapeutic relationship matters so deeply. When a therapist is calm, grounded, emotionally present, and genuinely regulated, clients often begin settling physiologically as well. Their nervous systems detect cues of safety and begin gradually down-regulating stress responses. Heart rate slows, breathing changes, defensiveness softens. The body begins shifting out of survival mode. This process is often referred to as co-regulation. And importantly, this is not simply a warm or abstract concept. It's deeply physiological. Interpersonal neurobiology researchers describe this as a form of embodied relational safety, a state in which clients remain emotionally engaged enough to process difficult material without becoming completely overwhelmed, shut down, dissociated, or pushed into fight or flight activation. But the implications of this become even more clinically significant when we consider the opposite side of the equation, because clients are not only detecting regulation, they are also detecting dysregulation. A therapist may be saying all the right clinical words while their nervous system is simultaneously communicating stress, distraction, defensiveness, anxiety, or emotional unavailability through subtle nonverbal cues. And clients often feel this immediately, even when they cannot consciously explain why. It could be shallow breathing, slight emotional disconnection, forced vocal warmth, subtle tension, incongruence. The body notices, which means verbal reassurance alone is often insufficient if the nervous system itself does not feel safe. And this completely reframes the role of therapist self-awareness. Therapist regulation is not merely self-care intended to prevent burnout. It's part of the clinical environment itself. The therapist's nervous system becomes one of the primary instruments of the therapeutic process. Not because therapists must be perfectly regulated human beings at all times, because that's impossible, but because presence, authenticity, embodiment, and nervous system awareness fundamentally shape how safety is experienced inside the therapeutic relationship. Ultimately, therapy is not simply about techniques, worksheets, or intellectual insight. It's a profoundly interpersonal process, a dynamic exchange between two nervous systems. And increasingly, modern research suggests that healing may occur not only through what is said in therapy, but through what is felt, regulated, repaired, and experienced within the relationship itself. This is part of the architecture of change, and perhaps one of the deepest truths emerging from attachment and interpersonal neurobiology research is this: we heal in connection, not in isolation. One of the most clinically important distinctions in contemporary psychotherapy research is the difference between a working alliance and secure attachment. Research found that you can have a strong therapeutic alliance, meaning you and the client agree on the goals, you're dutifully doing the tasks, and you genuinely like each other. But that does not necessarily mean you have established a secure attachment. A working alliance can appear strong on the surface. The therapist and client agree on goals, they complete tasks, they communicate respectfully, but secure attachment is tested through rupture. A rupture occurs when the relationship strains or disconnects. Maybe the therapist misunderstands the client. Maybe the client feels judged. Maybe the therapist missed emotional cues. Maybe anger emerges. Maybe the client withdraws emotionally. And in a polite, surface level working alliance, severe rupture like that might just end the therapy. The client just doesn't come back. It happens all the time. But in a secure attachment, the ongoing messy repair of those ruptures is what actually builds resilience. Repairing those ruptures is often where the deepest healing occurs. Research on rupture and repair demonstrated that successful repair processes can actually strengthen the therapeutic relationship rather than weaken it. Because surviving relational conflict without abandonment fundamentally challenges insecure attachment expectations. Clients begin learning conflict does not automatically end connection. I can express disappointment and still remain in relationship. My emotions are survivable, and therapists play a major role here. Defensive therapists often escalate ruptures. Reflective therapists explore them. A therapist capable of saying, I think I may have missed you there, or I can understand why that felt painful, creates enormous relational safety, not perfection, but repair. And interestingly, recent research also suggests that therapist attachment styles matter deeply here. Therapists carry their own attachment histories, insecurities, vulnerabilities, and countertransference reactions into the room. The difference is not whether therapists have wounds, because every therapist does. The difference is whether therapists possess enough reflective functioning or mentalization to recognize their own internal reactions without unconsciously acting them out onto clients. Secure therapists are often better to look beneath defensive client behaviors and recognize the unmet need underneath them. And this is one reason why personal therapy, supervision, consultation, and ongoing self-reflection remain ethically essential parts of clinical work. The therapist must continuously maintain the instrument. So after all of this, we return to this question. What does it actually mean that the relationship is the work? It means therapy is not simply about receiving advice, completing worksheets, or intellectually analyzing your life. Therapy is an active, dynamic, relational, and biological process. It involves building a working alliance based on bond, goals, and tasks, experiencing a secure base from which to explore, finding a safe haven to return to during overwhelm, surviving ruptures and repairing them, and slowly learning that vulnerability does not inevitably lead to rejection. And fundamentally, it involves co-regulating with another safe, authentic human being long enough for the nervous system to begin rewriting its expectations about connection. That is the architecture of change. We heal in connection, not in isolation. So if you're a therapist listening to this, remember that your presence and your way of being matters far more than you may sometimes realize. If you're a counseling student, maybe this reframes the overwhelming pressure to become a perfectly skilled technician. Technique matters deeply, but so does who you show up as in the room. And if you're a client sitting in therapy wondering why the relationship feels so important, the research is very clear. The relationship is not merely a backdrop for the work. The relationship is a major part of the work. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of where research meets relationship.